From being one of the most powerful men in Russia to being buried 6 feet under and his entire legacy being scrubbed clean, the life and death of Yevgeny Prigozhin is still shrouded in mystery. Over the years, he slowly climbed up the Russian government ladder until he became the right-hand man of Putin himself and a multi-millionaire to boot, with an entire army under his control. Then, he died suddenly in an accident. At least that's the story that the Russian government has reported. But in the moments before his death, you'd often hear the phrase that Yevgeny was a dead man walking, and so when it came time for his funeral, to most who knew him, it felt more like a formality than anything else. Just how did one man get so much power and then lose it all in the blink of an eye? And who was responsible for his death? This is the mysterious story of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Yevgeny's story starts in the city of Leningrad, Russia. It's one of the biggest cities in the entire country, with millions of people clawing for their right to survive. There, Yevgeny was born on 1st of June 1961 to his mother Violeta Kirovna Prigozhina and his father Viktor Yevgenyevich Prigozhin. Now, the first thing to know about this time period is that there were almost no rich people in Russia. Most people had a job, an apartment, and everything you'd expect a decent family to have, but 90% of them were struggling to make ends meet. In a typical family, both parents would be working full-time jobs and the children would be left to their own devices. Many children wouldn't even have access to toys, which meant that all they could do was be on the playground or interact with their peers. This is the environment that Yevgeny grew up in, having absolutely nothing to do and no one to keep him company. To make matters worse, he lost his dad when he was just 9 years old, which further increased his loneliness. It also meant that their income was suddenly halved, which meant that they could afford even less now. Eventually, his mum ended up remarrying, but all of this couldn't have been an easy change for young Yevgeny. In terms of school, Yevgeny wasn't the brightest kid out there, but in between all of that, he did find one thing that he liked: skiing. His stepfather, Samuel Fredmanovich Zhakoy, was a ski instructor and introduced Yevgeny to the sport. From the moment he tried it, he was absolutely obsessed. He ended up doing his graduation from Leningrad Sports Boarding School with the hope that he'd be able to become a professional skier. But after a major injury, he had to step away from the sport completely. So by this point, he was 18 years old with almost zero prospects, a degree in something he could never do again, and had absolutely nowhere to go. As with many other kids his age, he figured that the only thing left for him was a life of crime. He became part of a local gang and went on to commit a long list of crimes, from stealing to fraud to even a possible attempted murder charge that ended up getting dropped, and eventually he was sent to prison. At first, he was the most rebellious kid in the entire building, but in 1985, almost 4 years after his term started, he began to cool down. This is when he started to read intensively, quote unquote, and worked as a lathe operator, tractor driver, and cabinet maker after receiving training at a vocational school. In 1988, the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union reduced his sentence to 10 years on good behavior, noting that he'd begun corrective behavior, quote unquote, and from there he was released in 1990. In total, Prigozhin spent 9 years in detention, and those 9 years would shape the rest of his life. The first thing he did once he was out was go back to his mother and stepfather, who had fallen on hard times. So, as a way to pay the bills, they decided to open a small shop where they sold hot dogs. According to a New York Times interview with him, the rubles were piling up faster than his mother could count them. It turned out that all the time he'd spent reading in prison and working various jobs had turned him into more of a savvy businessman than the 18-year-old teen that he was before he served his time. Other than growing his mother's shop to serve more customers, he also became a big part of Russia's grocery scene. he became a 15% stakeholder and manager of Contrast, which was the first grocery store chain in St. Petersburg and was founded by his former classmate, Boris Spektor. In 1995, as the revenue from his other businesses started to fall, Yevgeny entered the restaurant business. He persuaded a director at Contrast, Kirill Ziminov, to open a restaurant with him, and they made that dream a reality when they opened Yevgeny's first restaurant, Old Customs House in St. Petersburg. In 1997, they founded a second restaurant, New Island, a floating restaurant that became one of the most fashionable dining spots in the city. Inspired by waterfront restaurants on the Seine in Paris, Yevgeny and Ziminov created the restaurant by spending US $400,000 to remodel a rusting boat on the Vyatka River. He said his patrons wanted to see something new in their lives and were tired of just eating cutlets with vodka, quote unquote. His big break came in 2001, when he had the first confirmed meeting with President Vladimir Putin. He personally served food to Vladimir Putin and French President Jacques Chirac when they dined at New Island. From there, New Island became famous for hosting presidents of various nationalities, including US President George W. Bush in 2002. In 2003, Putin returned to the restaurant to celebrate his birthday, indicating that New Island, and Yevgeny in particular, were already favored by the president. This is also when he got his nickname as Putin's chef, after catering for the Kremlin multiple times. But if there's one thing you can bet on when it comes to Yevgeny, then it's that he hates staying still and is always hungry for more power. In the early 2010s, he shifted his focus away from the culinary world and instead started recruiting soldiers from a small private army that he wanted to create, named the Wagner Group. At the start, it was a small army of barely 1,000 soldiers, most of them highly trained, but that didn't stop them from leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. Working closely with Putin, Yevgeny and his army were authorized to take part in numerous conflicts from Africa to Syria to the current war in Ukraine. For example, in Africa, it raided multiple mines, taking gold, silver, and timber back to Russia for the glory of the Kremlin. In the Central African Republic, the Wagner Group burnt entire villages to the ground and murdered everyone who lived there. In Mali, it helped in multiple unlawful executions, and in Sudan, it raided artisanal gold mines. According to The Economist, Wagner killed at least 1,800 African civilians as of August 2023. Wagner justifies its brutal presence in Africa as, quote, supporting peace and stability. However, in Mali alone, terrorist violence against civilians since 2021 has surged by 278%.
The Wagner Group.
Wagner Group.
The Wagner Group.
Wagner Group has a gruesome reputation.
So, considering that we already have all that information, why isn't any legal action being taken against them? The thing about the Wagner Group is that it's not a government entity. It's a private corporation that was being controlled by Yevgeny Prigozhin. And there is absolutely no way to prove that the Russian government had ordered Yevgeny to take all these actions. Even when someone would try to hold the Wagner Group accountable, Russian intelligence would step in and find a way to neutralize the situation, either by diplomacy or by force. Everything that the Wagner Group did was swept under the rug, but even then, it slowly gained a reputation for being one of the most brutal groups out there. Despite these accusations, the group played a crucial role in advancing Russian interests abroad, particularly in regions where the Kremlin sought to exert influence without direct military intervention. After all, Russia had plausible deniability for anything that Yevgeny did, and that was going to come in handy soon. While most people believe that the Russia-Ukraine war started in February of 2022, it has been going on all the way since 2014. and the Wagner Group has been there since the very start of it. The first full-on war that was part of the conflict was the war in Donbass, which began in April of 2014 when a commando unit seized Slaviansk, a city in the Donbass region of Ukraine. This led to the start of constant war in this region, which continues even till today. The Wagner Group played a key role in all this and greatly helped the Russian military from 2014 to 2015. This is also the time when the organization formally came together, becoming fully registered and recognized, though that came with its own issues, as now it had to be accountable for all its actions, including possible human rights violations for its actions in the war. Coming back to today, Russia began the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the Wagner Group was given one of the biggest roles in the war. Their strength grew from 1,000 soldiers to anywhere between 20,000 and 50,000 soldiers, most of whom were ex-convicts. Yevgeny had been in prison for nearly a decade of his life, which meant that it was an easy task for him to rally many of his fellow prisoners to fight for the Kremlin. And they were not afraid to fight dirty. For example, in January of 2022, around 400 members of the Wagner Group were flown to Ukraine in an attempt to assassinate President Volodymyr Zelensky and prepare Ukraine for Russian assault. By the time March rolled around, 3 assassination attempts were made in total on President Zelensky's life, out of which at least 2 were organized by the Wagner Group. The prisoners that were brought on were given anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 rubles for 6 months of service and full amnesty once their period of service was over. This meant that people who had done violent crimes, including murders, were being given the chance to fight in the war, and then once their contract was over, they were completely free to go back to killing again. But that's still just the tip of the iceberg. As the war went on and times became tough, the Wagner Group began to use more depraved tactics to get what they wanted. Ukrainian soldiers and former convict prisoners of war described the use of recruited convicts at Bakhmut as bait by the Wagner Group. Many convicts were poorly armed and briefly trained, which meant that there was no chance of them surviving on the battlefield. These men were then sent in human wave attacks to draw out and expose Ukrainian positions to attack by more experienced units or artillery. In 2023, journalist Joshua Yaffa reports that recruited prisoners make up approximately 80% of Wagner's manpower. They're identified with the letter K and deployed in waves in intervals of 15 to 20 minutes, whereas professional mercenaries are given the letter A and held back, quote-unquote, entering the battle only once Ukrainian defenses had been softened. Eventually, sanctions started to be put on the Wagner Group by international organizations, but most of them didn't even mention Yevgeny. They instead talked about a man named Dmitry Utkin, who was credited as the founder and leader of the organization. Utkin was a military veteran and had the rank of lieutenant colonel and brigade commander of a Spetsnaz GRU unit, which is basically the special forces in the Russian military. It's also believed that he is an admirer of Nazi Germany, with the group being named Wagner, for this very reason. According to Bellingcat, evidence suggests Utkin was more of a field commander, quote-unquote, and was not in the driver's seat of setting up this private army, but was employed as a convenient and deniable decoy to disguise its state provenance, quote-unquote. So that means that Yevgeny was only there to be the public face of the Wagner Group and spread as much misinformation as he could to prevent the Wagner Group from coming under scrutiny. This meant that at the end of the day, he was the most expendable person between him and Utkin, since all he did was be the public face for the corporation. But Yevgeny was in regular talks with the president. He was a multi-millionaire. He was the head of one of the most ruthless private mercenary companies out there. He felt like he mattered, that what he said mattered, and the war in Ukraine just didn't sit right with him. They had been fighting Ukrainian forces for 9 years now, and by this point, he felt like the Russian military was stagnating. It didn't help that the increased power and resources the Wagner Group was receiving caused him and the Ministry of Defense to be on increasingly bad terms. In February 2023, tensions began to escalate between Yevgeny and Russia's military establishment during the Russian winter offensive, with the only success Russian forces managed to achieve being in the direction of Bakhmut, which was accomplished by Wagner forces at the cost of heavy losses. Since February 2023, Prigozhin began to complain about the shell hunger, quote-unquote, of Wagner during the heavy fighting for Bakhmut. On 22nd of February, Prigozhin published another audio message where he accused Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and Gerasimov, chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, of not providing ammunition to Wagner detachments. He said, "The Wagner PMC kind of does not exist. We used to be given ammunition formally for some military units which like to take Bakhmut instead of us," quote unquote. According to Prigozhin, the Wagner PMC is walking around like a beggar from the world by a thread, asking unit commanders to help in some way, quote unquote. He was also increasingly critical of Putin as the war dragged on. He called members of the Putin-controlled Russian parliament useless and said that the deputies should go to the front, adding that those people who have been talking from tribunes for years need to start doing something, quote unquote. The Washington Post reported that Yevgeny was one of the few people who dared to tell Putin about the mistakes, quote unquote, of the Russian military commanders in the war in Ukraine. By June 2023, Yevgeny was aiming for the image of the people's hero of the special military operation. According to Russian sociologists and political scientists, Prigozhin increased his visibility, quote, through a combination of aggressive marketing and specific achievements, in particular the capture of Bakhmut. And since Bakhmut was the only major capture of the Russian army in many months, quote, the public could not ignore such an achievement. So by this point, according to him, he had the ear of the entire world and of the president. He was finally in a position where he could influence the outcome of this war and bring glory to the motherland as he promised to in all his videos. But then, a couple of weeks later, it all seemed to come crashing down when the Ministry of Defense ordered all members of the Wagner Group to sign contracts with the military. Essentially, this would mean that the Wagner Group was now a part of the Russian military, and hence Yevgeny would lose most of the influence that he had currently. Obviously, he couldn't sign it, but any attempts he made to circumvent the order were unsuccessful. The deadline was 1st of July 2023, and he was running out of time. So he decided to make one last bid for freedom. One last plan that, if it worked, would make him the most powerful man in Russia. On 23rd of June 2023, Yevgeny claimed that regular Russian armed forces had launched missile strikes against Wagner forces, killing a huge quote-unquote number. He called for a response, stating, "The Council of Commanders of PMC Wagner has made a decision. The evil that the military leadership of the country brings must be stopped," quote unquote. Yevgeny declared the start of an armed conflict against the Ministry of Defense in a message posted on his press service's Telegram channel. He called upon individuals interested in joining the conflict against the ministry, portraying the rebellion as a response to the alleged strike on his men. In a video released on the same day, he also claimed that the government's justifications for invading Ukraine were based on falsehoods, designed only to further the interests of the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian oligarchs. He accused the Ministry of Defense of attempting to deceive the public and President Vladimir Putin by portraying Ukraine as an aggressive and hostile adversary that, in collaboration with NATO, was plotting an attack on Russian interests. Specifically, he denied that any Ukrainian escalation took place prior to 24th of February 2022, which was one of the central points of Russian justification for the war. From there, he repeatedly asked for a meeting with the president, but he was denied every time. Ultimately, he never did get the meeting with Putin that he was hoping for, and nothing changed. A peace was brokered between the Russian government and the Wagner Group, with all charges being dropped for Yevgeny. But the damage was already done. Whether you agreed with Yevgeny or not, his actions of marching into Moscow and then giving up almost immediately showed weakness. It also weakened the efficiency of the Russian government, considering just how easy it was for Yevgeny to march into Moscow, mostly uncontested. Even after the charges were dropped, Yevgeny still continued to be investigated for treason. But by now, you should know about Yevgeny that he's not the kind of person to sit still. He was going to rebuild everything and then get back on track to be one of the most powerful people in the world. After this, Yevgeny began to travel constantly, especially between Moscow and St. Petersburg, considering that they were two of the most important cities in Russia. He still had many friends after the revolution, such as Utkin, who still seemed to support Yevgeny, as well as other people like Russian General Sergei Surovikin, who maintained good relations with him. He also had multiple businesses under his belt and a huge variety of assets that he slowly started to mobilize in the hopes of getting back on track and showing the world that he wasn't done just yet. By the time late August rolled around, things were going pretty well. He was nowhere near having the power he held before the revolution, but things were going all right. The Ministry of Defense and Yevgeny seemed to have some level of truce, and it seemed like all his power had got him off the hook for his actions. The Kremlin was going to let him live. After the mutiny, he would hear whispers that he was a dead man walking, and now the Russian government would retaliate. Whether that retaliation would come by freezing his assets or killing him directly, that remained to be seen. But 2 months had passed since those whispers, and nothing had happened. So they changed. They talked about how Putin and his inner circle were getting weak, unable to deal with traitors. At the same time, Yevgeny was talking to people daily, convincing them to support his cause. Utkin and around 8 other major members of the Wagner Group would frequently accompany him on these trips. But then, on August 23rd, exactly 2 months after the June Revolution, it seemed as though Putin finally got his revenge. The plane that carried Yevgeny and the rest of the founding members went down during a routine flight from Moscow to St. Petersburg. At first, people didn't worry too much. In 2019, during a flight to Congo that had gone down, initially it was reported that Yevgeny had died, but 3 days later he seemingly rose back from the dead and told the world that the person who actually died was just a body double. And that wasn't the only false report of his death. So they waited for a few days this time. Curiously enough, on the same day as his plane crashed, multiple of Yevgeny's known associates were fired from their positions, including the Russian general Sergei Surovikin that I mentioned before. So when this happened again, another obvious assassination attempt, people thought he would somehow survive it. 4 days after the plane crash, forensics came back with a report. Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's chef, and Dmitry Utkin were dead. So what happened? How did he die? And was anyone responsible? The thing to understand here is that from the moment Yevgeny launched his June mutiny against the Russian general staff and indirectly against President Vladimir Putin himself, there has been intense interest in Putin's response. 2 months later, with Prigozhin's reported death in a plane crash north of Moscow, it seems there is an answer. The boss of the Kremlin has taken his revenge. It's not hard to come up with examples of Putin's vindictiveness towards those he regards as traitors. It's a long list, and he explicitly labeled Yevgeny a traitor in the immediate aftermath of the June mutiny. Add to this a widespread perception that Putin showed weakness in his initial handling of the revolt, and it's easy to argue that he seized on the opportunity for a conspicuous, even dramatic show of force. Putin does not like to show weakness, particularly at a time when he surely knows that his own advisors question his judgment. He may have seen this decision as important to re-establishing his leadership. For many years, he's tried to make stability his brand, and he has to know that his own actions in launching the war on Ukraine have weakened that claim. Moreover, Yevgeny was one of the few people who dared to criticize him directly, which made him the perfect person to make an example of. So, the first and most probable theory is that Putin directly ordered Yevgeny to be eliminated, though there are still many other theories out there. In the past few years, Putin's managerial style has unfolded to reveal that he's quite detached from the day-to-day workings of the Russian government, and since the start of the war, he has been perceived as more aloof and indecisive than in the past. This leads many in Putin's inner circles to act based on what he would want rather than receiving direct orders from him. So there's a good chance that some of Putin's staff, especially his current right-hand man Nikolai Patrushev, might have been the ones who directly ordered the execution. A third theory that has come up is that, in reality, it was just an accident that the Russian government took advantage of. There's a lot of information out there to suggest that it was just an accident, such as the fact that the plane's Brazilian manufacturer said it had ceased servicing the aircraft because of sanctions on Russia, or that the Wagner leadership team had just returned from an exhausting trip to Africa to renew their ties with its clients there, and that air defense units around Moscow were on high alert because of Ukrainian drone attacks. So maybe something went haywire that day and caused the death of Yevgeny and Utkin, and maybe the Russian government used this event, deliberately making the data murkier to create more mystery about it in the hopes that any would-be traitors would be discouraged from speaking out against the government. Overall, any of these theories can fit the situation perfectly. We just don't have access to enough information to find out what truly happened that day. Yet. But one thing that we know for sure is that after his mutiny attempt in June, Yevgeny Prigozhin just had to die.